She was 20 years old, alone in the world, and standing in the dust of Harrow Gulch with $6.11 to her name. The sum total of everything she had salvaged from a life that had been stripped from her by a single man's signature on a single piece of paper. His name was Aldis Crane, her late father's business partner, and he had used the law the way a surgeon uses a blade, precisely, coldly, and without a moment's hesitation. When her father died of a fever in the spring of 1887, Crane had produced a document none of them had ever seen, a deed of partnership dissolution, signed in her father's own hand 2 years prior, transferring all assets of Mercer and Crane freighting to Crane alone in the event of either partner's death. The lawyers had studied it, the judge had accepted it, and Nora Mercer had walked out of the Harrow County Courthouse with the clothes on her back, a carpet bag containing her mother's Bible and her father's compass, and $6.11 from the petty cash drawer that even Crane had not thought to claim. She spent one night on the floor of the Lutheran church. She spent the next morning walking the length of Harrow Gulch's single commercial street, studying the posted notices and the boarded windows, taking stock of what a person could do when they had next to nothing. And that is when she saw it, a handwritten card tacked to the door of the old Halverson assay office at the far end of the Gulch, the one that had been shuttered for going on 11 years, its windows brown with grime, its sign hanging at a 45-degree angle, its porch boards soft with rot. The card read, "For sale. $6. Inquire at Tolliver's feed." Everyone who saw Nora Mercer count those $6 into old Gideon Tolliver's palm told the same story afterward, that the girl looked like she was signing her own death warrant and knew it, and did it anyway. She could not have known what was waiting for her behind the shelves inside that office. She could not have known that the iron safe bolted to the back wall, the one nobody had opened in 11 years, the one whose combination had supposedly died with old Emil Halverson himself, held something that would not only restore her own life, but return to the people of Harrow Gulch, something that had been stolen from every last one of them. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Mercer. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten or written off, tell us about it in the comments. We would genuinely love to hear from you. Nora Elspeth Mercer had not been born into hardship, but she had been raised in close enough proximity to it that she understood its grammar fluently, the way a child raised near the sea learns to read the weather in the color of the horizon. Her father, Thomas Mercer, had come west from Ohio in 1863 with $40, a strong back, and a conviction that the freight business would outlast any gold strike, because men would always need things moved from one place to another, regardless of whether they were rich or desperate. He had been right about that, and by the time Nora came into the world in 1867, Thomas Mercer operated a modest but stable freighting company out of Harrow Gulch, a narrow canyon settlement in the hill country of northern New Mexico Territory that had sprung up in the wake of a silver boom and refused to entirely disappear after the boom went quiet. Her mother, Clara Mercer, Neubauer, had been the daughter of a German clockmaker who had emigrated to St. Louis, and she carried within her a precise and patient intelligence that expressed itself in everything she touched. She could fix a wagon axle and repair a pocket watch with equal confidence. She kept meticulous accounts in ledgers with a hand so neat it looked typeset. She taught Nora to read before the girl was 4, to cipher before she was 6, and to understand that numbers were not merely symbols, but a language, one that did not lie, did not soften bad news, and could not be manipulated by anyone who understood it well enough to check another person's work. Clara Mercer died of pneumonia in the winter of 1879, when Nora was 12 years old, and what she left behind was not grief alone, but a daughter who could read a balance sheet the way most girls her age read a hymn book, with fluency, with reverence, and with the quiet understanding that accuracy was a form of honesty. Thomas Mercer never remarried. He poured himself into the freight business and into Nora's education with equal devotion, and when she was old enough, he brought her into the office not as an ornament or a convenience, but as a genuine partner in the operation. She handled the accounts. She negotiated supply contracts with the dry goods merchants and the mine operators up in the hills. She could spot a discrepancy in an invoice at 20 paces, and she had done so more than once when a supplier tried to slip a rounded-up figure past her on the assumption that a young woman would not notice. What she loved, though, the thing that sustained her in a way that had nothing to do with commerce or survival, was the land itself. The gulch in early morning, when the shadow lay long and blue across the canyon floor, and the scrub oak caught the first light along its topmost leaves. The smell of the high country after rain, that particular combination of pine resin and wet clay that seemed to her the most honest smell in the world, because it was the smell of something being washed clean. She had grown up in this narrow, steep-sided place, and she understood its rhythms and its moods and its silences in the way that only a person who has never truly left a place can understand it. She had grown up trusting it. That was, perhaps, the vulnerability she carried into everything that followed. Her father had taken Aldis Crane on as a partner in 1883, 4 years before his death, when a run of bad luck, a wagon lost to a flash flood, a mule team stolen by men who were never caught, a fire that damaged the warehouse, had left Thomas Mercer temporarily short on capital. Crane was a land speculator and a moneylender who operated out of Santa Fe. A compact and well-dressed man in his late 40s with a reputation for legal precision and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had offered Thomas an infusion of capital in exchange for a 50% partnership stake, and Thomas, in a moment that Nora would later understand had been the hinge point of their family's fate, had accepted. Crane was rarely present in Harrow Gulch during those 4 years. He sent letters. He reviewed ledgers. He made occasional visits of a day or two, during which he asked careful questions and wrote things in a small notebook that he kept in his breast pocket. He was always courteous to Nora, which she had taken for warmth, and which she later understood had been the precise opposite of it. It was the courtesy of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and sees no reason to make enemies he doesn't need. Thomas Mercer died on a Tuesday in April, and by the following Monday, Aldis Crane had filed the dissolution document in Harrow County and had the company's assets transferred into his sole name. Nora had stood in that courtroom with a lawyer borrowed from the Lutheran minister's congregation, a young man fresh from his training in Albuquerque, and she had watched the judge read Crane's document and accept it without apparent doubt, and she had felt the floor shift beneath her in the way she imagined the floor of a mine shaft shifts when the timbering gives way, a slow, structural surrender that ends in darkness. She did not cry in that courtroom. She had her mother's discipline in that regard. She waited until she was alone on the steps of the church that evening, in the blue dusk with the canyon walls rising around her on both sides, and then she cried for a long time, not only for herself, but for her father, and for her mother, and for all the years of careful, honest work that had been folded into a single legal document and handed to a stranger. And then she stopped, and she went inside, and she slept on the church floor, and in the morning she went looking for a way forward. The assay office had belonged to Emil Halverson, who had come to Harrow Gulch in 1871 during the height of the silver excitement, and had operated the town's only assay service for the better part of 15 years. He had been a small, precise Norwegian man with enormous mutton chop whiskers, and a reputation for absolute honesty in a trade that did not always attract honest men. Miners trusted him because his scales were calibrated, and his figures never varied in anyone's favor but the truth's. He had been, in the language the old-timers used when they spoke of him, a square dealer. And in Harrow Gulch, in those years, that was not a small thing. He had died in 1876 of a heart condition that had been troubling him for some time, and the office had been closed immediately after his death. His only heir was a nephew in Minneapolis, who had written a letter to the county clerk asking that the property be sold and the proceeds forwarded. But the nephew had never followed up, and no buyer had ever appeared, and the building had simply sat there at the end of the commercial street for 11 years, accumulating dust and disrepair and a kind of local mythology. People said Emil's ghost still walked the back room, which Nora suspected was simply the building settling in the cold nights. Gideon Tolliver had been holding the property in a loose administrative capacity for the county, waiting for someone to either claim it or buy it. And when Nora came to his feed store and told him she wanted to purchase the assay office, the old man had looked at her over the tops of his spectacles with an expression that she could not quite read. "You know it needs considerable work," he said. "I know that," she said. "The roof's gone soft in 2 places. The porch will need to be rebuilt before winter. I know that too." "What do you intend to do with an assay office, Miss Mercer?" "There's been no silver worth speaking of in this gulch for going on 8 years. I intend to have 4 walls and a door that locks," she said, "and to start from there." He had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had taken her $6 without further argument, and she had thought she detected something in his expression as she turned to go. Not quite pity, but something adjacent to it, something older and quieter, like recognition. She spent that first afternoon unlocking the door with the key Tolliver had given her, and standing in the threshold, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness. The office was a single long room, with a wooden counter running its width about 2/3 of the way back, and behind the counter were shelves that ran floor to ceiling, still holding the relics of Emil Halverson's professional life. Ceramic crucibles in graduated sizes, a pair of brass scales behind a cracked glass case, several rows of small brown glass bottles with handwritten labels, a collection of iron rods and tongs arranged in a rack on the wall. The equipment was old and furred with dust but intact, carefully maintained until the day its owner died and then simply frozen in time, like a clock that had been stopped by hand. The smell of the place was mineral and dry, a combination of old chemicals and stone dust, and the particular mustiness of a closed space that had once held heat and activity, and now held only their ghost. Nora stood in that smell and breathed it and thought, "This is where I live now." She swept the floor that evening. She found a broom behind the counter, and she swept methodically from the back of the room to the front, working slowly, turning the broom so the bristles caught the corners. She was nearly finished when the broom handle struck the back wall behind the lowest row of shelves, with a sound that was different from the sound of wood striking wood. A hollow, resonant clang, metallic and deep. She moved the shelf unit. It swung out from the wall on a crude hinge that someone had mounted long ago, and there it was. The safe was perhaps 2.5 feet tall and 2 feet wide, bolted through its feet to both the floor and the back wall, its black iron face mottled with old dust and a red-brown corrosion that was not quite rust. The dial was a brass compass rose divided into 40 positions. There was no external damage, no marks from a pry bar, no evidence that anyone had ever attempted to open it by force. It had simply sat there behind the shelf unit, in the dark, for 11 years. Nora put her hand flat against its face. The iron was cold through her palm, cold in the particular way of things that have been untouched for a very long time. The cold of deep shadow and absolute stillness. She did not know the combination. She had no way of knowing the combination. But she knew, with a certainty she could not explain, and would not have tried to, that whatever was inside that safe was the reason she had been pointed toward this particular building on this particular morning, or, if not pointed, then drawn. The way iron filings are drawn to a magnet by a force that requires no awareness on the part of the iron to operate. She replaced the shelf and went to sleep on her coat on the floor of the front room. And she did not dream, and in the morning she began to think carefully about what she knew and what she might find out. In a town as small as Harrow Gulch, the memory of the community was the community itself. The old-timers were the archives, and the oldest timer of all, in terms of years in the Gulch, if not in biological age, was a woman named Augustina Reyes Vidal, who had come to the Gulch in 1868 with her husband and 3 children when he was working the first Mercer silver claim, and who had stayed on through everything that followed, running a laundry and alterations business from a house on the upper end of the canyon that had grown room by room over the decades until it was the largest structure in Harrow Gulch. Nora had known Augustina her whole life. Everyone had. She was a woman of approximately 60, who carried herself with the unhurried authority of someone who has outlasted most of the things that once threatened her, and who had consequently arrived at a state of calm that lesser people sometimes mistook for indifference. Nora went to see her on the second morning after purchasing the assay office. Emil Halverson's safe, Augustina said, when Nora had explained what she had found. She was quiet for a moment, sorting a pile of mending in her lap with hands that moved with automatic precision. I knew that safe was there. Emil mentioned it once, years back. He said he had put important documents in it for safekeeping. What kind of documents? He did not say specifically. But I remember, she paused, setting down the mending. This would have been in 1875 or early 1876, before he died. There was a great deal of trouble in the Gulch that year. You were too young to remember, and your mother and father didn't speak of it much, I think, because your father was not directly involved. But many of the mining families, my husband included, had purchased stakes in what they were told was a newly registered claim in the Upper Canyon. A man named Decker Hoyle organized it. He sold shares, took the money, and then, well, he left, Nora said. He left, Augustina confirmed, with approximately $4,000 that belonged to 17 families in this gulch. Some of those families never recovered from it. The Prentice family left the following spring. The Abrius lost their house. My husband, she stopped, smoothed the mending with one hand. It set us back considerably. And Emil Halverson? Emil was furious about it. He had not purchased shares himself. He said he had never trusted Hoyle. Could not say why precisely, just a feeling in his bones. But he felt responsible in some way because Hoyle had used the assay office as a kind of legitimizing location. He had brought potential investors there, shown them ore samples, had Emil evaluate them in front of witnesses. Emil felt he had been used as a prop in a confidence scheme, and he was not a man who forgave that kind of thing. Nora was very still. Do you know if Emil found anything on Hoyle? Any documentation? Augustina looked at her with the quiet directness of a woman who had learned to say difficult things without preamble. I know he spent the last months of his life trying to. I know he wrote letters. I know he had friends in Santa Fe and in Albuquerque who were involved in the Territorial Land Office. Whether he found anything, she spread her hands. He died before he could tell us. Nora walked back to the assay office in the long light of late afternoon. And she sat behind the old counter and looked at the shelves that concealed the safe, and she thought about $4,000 and 17 families and a man named Decker Hoyle. and an assayer who had died with his secrets locked behind iron and a brass dial. She thought about her mother, who had taught her that numbers do not lie. She thought about her father, who had believed in square dealing. And then she began, with the systematic patience her mother had instilled in her, to think about how a man who had calibrated his scales to absolute precision would have chosen a combination for a lock he intended to be opened only by someone he trusted, and what clues he might have left behind for such a person to find. The assay office's records were still on the shelves, 15 years of ledgers in Emil Halverson's small, exacting hand, organized by year in matching brown cloth covers. Nora began reading them that evening by lamplight, starting from the beginning, working forward. It was slow work and detailed work, and the kind of work she was built for. She found what she was looking for on the 7th day. In the ledger for 1875, the last full year of Emil's life and the year of Decker Hoyle's fraud, there was an entry that did not match the format of any other entry in 15 years of records. Most entries recorded a client name, a sample description, an assay result, and a fee. This entry recorded a date, a time, and 3 numbers separated by dashes, 14-27-6. Below the numbers, in handwriting slightly more pressured than Emil's usual hand, as if written with greater intention, for the one who sweeps the back room clean. Nora's hands were not entirely steady as she crossed the office, moved the shelf unit on its hinge, and stood before the safe. She set her fingers on the brass dial. She turned it carefully to the right, counting 14. Left to 27. Right to 6. She heard the mechanism release before she felt it, a deep, satisfying click from somewhere in the iron chest, like the sound of something long held finally letting go. The door swung outward on its hinges with a low groan, releasing a smell of old paper and metal and time, the smell of a sealed place finally breathing again. Inside the safe, stacked with characteristic neatness, were documents, many documents. And beneath the documents, in a cloth pouch tied with a leather cord, a smaller envelope sealed with red wax, with words written on the front in Emil Halverson's hand. The envelope read, for the county clerk of Harrow, to be opened in the presence of witnesses. Contents: evidence of the fraudulent land registration filed by one Decker Hoyle of Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory, in the matter of the Consolidated Upper Canyon Mining Shares, 1875, also enclosed the true deed of beneficial ownership for the Upper Canyon parcel, held in trust for the defrauded shareholders by Emil J. Halverson, assayer, 17 families. Their names are within. Nora sat down on the floor of the assay office, in the dust and the lamplight, with the envelope in her hands, and for the second time in recent weeks she cried, but this time it was not from loss. It was from something she did not have an immediate word for, a feeling that was part astonishment and part grief, and part the specific, complicated relief of understanding that the world had not, in fact, lost count of what it owed. Emil Halverson had spent the last months of his life tracking Decker Hoyle's fraud through the Territorial Land Office's records. What was in that safe was a complete legal case, copies of the fraudulent registration documents with annotations showing the forgeries, sworn affidavits from land office clerks in Santa Fe who had identified the forged signatures, correspondence with a territorial attorney who had agreed to take the matter to court, and, most critically, a deed of trust for the Upper Canyon parcel, executed by Hoyle and witnessed by 2 men whose names were on record, showing that Hoyle had in fact purchased the parcel legitimately before selling fraudulent shares in it, which meant the land itself was real, the shares were legally actionable, and the 17 families had a valid claim to the value of what they had purchased. The deed was in Emil's custody as trustee, held for the families, waiting, he had died before he could deliver it. And it had waited in the dark for 11 years. The difficulty was this. 2 of the men whose names appeared on the land office documents had, in the intervening years, moved to Harrow Gulch. One of them was a minor functionary at the county clerk's office. The other was a man named Gideon Tolliver. Nora sat with this knowledge for 2 full days before she moved on it, not from fear but from the need to be certain. She read the documents 3 times in their entirety. She cross-referenced the names in Emil's ledgers. She made a careful list of what was provable and what was circumstantial, and what would require a territorial attorney to evaluate. She was not afraid of Tolliver. She was, if she was honest with herself, not even angry at him, or not primarily angry. What she felt was the cold clarity of someone looking at a problem that has a correct solution and intending to find it. On the morning of the 3rd day, she went to see Augustina Reyes Vidal again. "I have found what Emil Halverson locked in that safe," she said, "and I need to tell you what is in it before I tell anyone else, because your family is one of the 17. Augustina received this information with the stillness of a woman who has lived long enough to believe in providence even when it takes 11 years to arrive. She read the documents that Nora spread across her kitchen table. She was silent for a long time. "Gideon Tolliver," she said finally, not as an accusation, but as a fact being confirmed. "His signature is on the registration," Nora said, "as a witness. He was in Santa Fe that year. I checked the postal records Emil kept. Tolliver received a letter from Hoyle 6 weeks before the scheme began. He sold me this office," Nora said. "Knowing what was in it, or not knowing," Augustina said, and then reconsidered. "No, he knew. He has always been a careful man about property. He would have inventoried it. He sold it to me for $6, Nora said, believing I would have no reason to look behind the shelves. Or believing no one would, Augustina said. He has held that property for 11 years. He could have bought it himself. He chose not to." She folded her hands on the table. Perhaps he was afraid of it. Perhaps he believed that if he never opened the building, it would simply continue not mattering. What happened next took 3 weeks and required a lawyer from Santa Fe, a woman named Constance Aldridge, who had recently been admitted to the territorial bar, and who came to Harrow Gulch by stage with a leather case full of legal papers and an expression of composed determination that Nora recognized and respected. The documents were presented to the county judge. The territorial land office was formally notified. The clerk who had assisted in the original fraud was removed from his position. Gideon Tolliver resigned from the county property board, quietly, on a Tuesday morning. Without being asked directly to do so, he simply submitted his resignation and did not appear in his feed store for 2 weeks afterward. And when he returned, he was a smaller man somehow, diminished, moving through the town with the careful gait of someone who has had a large thing taken from him without anyone raising their voice. The 17 families, or what remained of them in Harrow Gulch, which was 9 families, the others having dispersed across the territory in the years following the fraud, received a settlement from the territorial government based on the current assessed value of the Upper Canyon parcel, which had been purchased by a mining concern from Denver in 1882 and had produced a modest but consistent ore yield ever since. The settlement was not the $4,000 that had been stolen from them. It was, with interest and damages calculated by Constance Aldridge's careful hand, considerably more. Augustina Reyes Vidal received her family's share on a Wednesday morning and stood on her porch with the bank draft in her hand and looked at Nora for a long moment before she spoke. "Your mother," she said, "would have called this arithmetic." Nora laughed, actually laughed, the first time in many weeks, and said that yes, her mother probably would have. There remained the matter of Aldis Crane. Nora had not forgotten him. She had simply understood that Crane would keep. The case against Crane was a different matter from the case of Emil's documents. It was murkier, more expensive, more uncertain in its outcome. But Constance Aldridge, in the course of reviewing the settlement documents, had noticed something. Thomas Mercer's signature on the partnership dissolution deed, the one Crane had produced in the courthouse, did not match Thomas Mercer's signature in the freight company's own records, copies of which had been subpoenaed as part of the settlement proceedings and were now on file with the court. The discrepancy was small. It was the kind of thing a person would not notice unless they were looking at many documents and were attentive to the specific way a hand forms certain letters. Constance Aldridge was precisely that kind of person. She filed the observation with the court as a footnote to the settlement documentation, carefully worded, making no accusation, simply noting the variance and inviting the court's attention to it. That footnote would take another year to become a formal investigation, and another year after that to result in a civil judgment against Aldis Crane, the reversal of the dissolution deed, and the return of Mercer and Crane Freighting, reorganized, smaller, but alive, to its rightful owner. But all of that was in the future. What was present, on the morning that the Reyes-Vidal family received their bank draft, was Nora Mercer standing in the weak autumn sunlight in front of the old Halverson assay office, which she had spent the previous 6 weeks repairing with the help of 3 young men from the settlement families who had offered their labor freely and gladly. The porch was rebuilt, the roof was patched, the windows had been cleaned until they let in the morning light. The sign, which read Halverson's assay, the original painted board rehung at its proper angle, caught the sun and threw it back in a warm reddish gold. She had no plans to operate an assay office. There was not enough mining activity in the gulch for that. What she intended to do was something she had been working toward since the 2nd week in the office, when she had sat behind Emil Halverson's counter reading his ledgers and realized that his meticulous record-keeping contained, in its accumulated detail, a complete history of every ore sample that had passed through Harrow Gulch's mining operations. A record that no one else possessed. A record that could be used to make a legitimate case for reopening several claims that had been abandoned under uncertain circumstances. She intended to use the assay office as a land records and title research service, working with the Territorial Land Office to help families in the region verify their claims and identify irregularities of the kind that had cost the 17 families their savings. There was, it turned out, a considerable amount of work in that line. Constance Aldridge agreed to be her legal partner, traveling from Santa Fe twice a month for the first year, and then, finding that the work suited her and that she liked the particular quality of the air in the gulch, relocating permanently and taking a room in Augustina Reyes-Vidal's expanded house. It was not the freight company. It was not the life Nora had expected. But it was hers, and it had been built from $6 and a broom and the particular willingness to look behind the shelves that most people had not thought to develop, or had developed, and been afraid of what they might find. We began this story with a young woman standing in the dust of Harrow Gulch, with $6 in her hand and a door she did not know how to open. We began with a building that everyone had walked past for 11 years without stopping, a safe that no one had opened, and a girl that a confident man had dismissed as easily managed. What we did not begin with, what we perhaps should state plainly now, at the story's close, is the nature of what Nora Mercer actually carried into that derelict building on that October morning in 1887. It was not the $6, though those mattered. It was not cleverness, though she had that. It was not even the meticulous precision her mother had instilled in her, though that was the specific instrument through which everything else flowed. What Nora Mercer carried was the willingness to believe that something other people had written off still had value. That the overlooked thing, the discarded place, the building at the end of the road that nobody wanted, might be exactly the thing that was needed and could not be replaced. Emil Halverson had been dead for 11 years. His careful work, his moral outrage, his letter writing and his record keeping, and his absolute conviction that the families of Harrow Gulch deserved to have what had been taken from them returned. All of it had been sitting in the dark, waiting not for a hero, but for someone patient enough and humble enough to sweep the floor and listen to what the building had to say. There is a kind of justice that does not arrive on horseback or announce itself with trumpets. It arrives in the form of a 20-year-old woman who had lost everything, who could only afford to buy the thing nobody else wanted, who swept the back room clean and found what was waiting. Nora Mercer operated the Halverson Building Land Records Office until 1921, when she retired at the age of 54, having helped resolve 437 title disputes across 3 territories and 2 states. She never moved from Harrow Gulch. She was buried in the Canyon Cemetery, on a hillside that catches the morning light, not far from her parents and not far from a small marker for Emil J. Halverson that she had commissioned herself. In granite, with the words she felt he deserved, he kept honest scales. The assay office still stands. The shelves still swing out on their hinge. The safe is open now, empty of everything but air and time, its door pinned back against the wall, so that anyone who cares to can look inside and understand what it once held, and why it mattered. Thank you truly for spending this time with us and with Nora's story. If this one moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need it today. Someone who is standing in front of a door that looks like it has nothing to offer, or who has been told that what they have left is not enough to build on. Before you go, we want to leave you with one question to sit with. What is a time in your own life when you found unexpected value? In a place, in a person, in an object, in yourself, that everyone else had already written off? We would love to read your answers in the comments. Every one of those stories matters. Until next time, stay close.